When a black family arrived at a luxury hotel, the staff sneered and refused to check them in. But just minutes later, their smug smiles vanished as they realized who they had just turned away. The glass doors of the Grand Wellington Hotel slid open with a soft hiss, letting in the crisp evening air. The opulent lobby gleamed under the golden chandelier lights, casting a warm glow over the marble floors. Wealth dripped from every corner. The velvet chairs, the mahogany front desk, the scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air. Through the entrance stepped a black family of 3, a man, a woman, and a young girl, no older than 7. They moved with a quiet grace, exuding an air of quiet confidence that turned a few heads. The father, Jonathan Carter, was a tall man with broad shoulders, dressed in a tailored navy suit that fit him perfectly. His shoes, polished to a mirror shine, clicked softly against the marble as he walked. His sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail with an observant calm. Beside him, his wife Naomi carried herself with elegance. She wore a cream-colored blazer over a silk blouse, paired with tailored trousers that spoke of effortless wealth. Her natural curls framed her striking face, and her diamond stud earrings caught the light each time she moved. She held a designer handbag in one hand and the handle of a sleek, expensive suitcase in the other. Holding her mother's hand was Ava, their daughter, a bright-eyed little girl dressed in a neat white dress with gold ballet flats. Her hair was styled into neat braids adorned with small golden beads that clicked gently as she turned her head. She clutched a stuffed bear, the only thing about her that didn't scream luxury. The family walked toward the front desk, their presence commanding the space in a way that was impossible to ignore. Yet, instead of being welcomed with the usual warm professionalism the hotel was known for, they were met with something else, a cold, lingering hesitation. Behind the front desk stood Emma, the hotel's receptionist. A slender woman in her early 30s, she wore the standard uniform, a crisp white blouse and a black blazer. But her stiff posture and the way she narrowed her eyes at the approaching family betrayed her thoughts. Her fingers hesitated on the keyboard, her red-painted nails tapping lightly against the surface. Next to her, the hotel manager, Richard, stood with his arms crossed. A middle-aged man with neatly combed blonde hair and a perfectly ironed suit. He watched the family's approach with thinly veiled disapproval. His mouth pressed into a tight line, his expression unreadable, but his eyes gave him away, calculating, judgmental. When Jonathan stopped at the front desk, he offered a polite, professional smile. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth and deep. "We have a reservation, the Carter family." Emma didn't smile back. She only blinked, her lips tightening as she glanced at Richard before turning back to the computer screen. Her fingers moved sluggishly over the keyboard, her reluctance almost palpable. A beat of silence. Then, without looking up, she said, "I'm sorry, but I don't see any reservation under that name." Naomi arched an eyebrow, her perfectly manicured fingers tightening slightly around the handle of her suitcase. "That's strange," she said, keeping her tone even. "I booked our suite weeks ago. Could you check again?" Emma let out a barely concealed sigh and typed something again, slower this time. Then she shook her head, her expression carefully blank. "Nope. Nothing here," she said dismissively. "And unfortunately, we're completely booked for the night." There was something in her tone. Something just a little too quick, a little too final. Jonathan's jaw tensed slightly, but his expression remained composed. He knew this game, he had played it before. "Really?" he said, tilting his head. "Because I'm quite sure I received a confirmation email." He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and held up the screen, displaying the exact booking confirmation with the hotel's logo. The proof was undeniable. Emma's eyes flickered to the phone for a fraction of a second before her expression hardened. "That's odd," she muttered, her voice clipped. "But still, I'm afraid we don't have any rooms available." Jonathan exchanged a glance with Naomi, whose lips pressed into a thin line. Ava, still clutching her stuffed bear, looked between her parents, sensing the tension but not fully understanding it. At that moment, the front doors opened again, and a white couple walked in. The man dressed in a golf polo and khakis approached the desk with a casual ease. "Hi, we'd like a room for the night," he said. Emma's entire demeanor changed in an instant. Her posture straightened, her expression softened, and she offered a pleasant professional smile. "Of course, sir. Let me just check our availability." Jonathan didn't miss the way her fingers suddenly moved with more urgency over the keyboard. In less than 5 seconds, she chirped, "Yes, we have a deluxe suite available for you." A heavy silence settled in the air. Naomi's gaze darkened. "I thought you were fully booked." Emma froze for half a second before quickly recovering. We just had a last-minute cancellation." Richard, who had been silent the entire time, cleared his throat and took a step forward, his presence imposing. "If you don't have a reservation, I'm afraid there's nothing we can do for you," he said, his voice cool, dismissive. "Hotel policy." Jonathan took a slow breath, forcing himself to remain composed. This wasn't about availability. This was about something else entirely, and he wasn't going to let it slide. A tense silence settled over the front desk. The soft hum of the hotel's grand chandelier buzzed above them, but the warmth of the golden lights did nothing to ease the chill in the air. Jonathan's hand remained steady as he held out his phone, the glowing screen displaying the confirmed reservation. His name, Jonathan Carter, was right there in bold letters, along with the booking details and the amount already paid in full. Emma, the receptionist, didn't even bother looking closely. She crossed her arms and let out a sigh, her red-painted nails tapping against the polished desk. "I'm sorry, sir," she said again, her voice tight, clipped. "I don't know what to tell you, but there are no rooms available." Naomi's jaw tightened. She had dealt with this kind of thinly veiled discrimination before. The way Emma refused to meet their eyes, the way she tensed ever so slightly. When they approached the desk, it was all too familiar. "Could you at least check again?" Naomi asked, her tone firm yet polite. "We booked weeks ago. We have a confirmation email." Emma let out another small sigh, this time one of exaggerated patience, as if she were being inconvenienced. She tapped the keyboard half-heartedly, her eyes scanning the screen for barely 2 seconds before shaking her head. "Nope, no record of your reservation. And even if there was, as I said before, we're completely booked." Jonathan's fingers curled slightly around his phone, but his face remained unreadable. He had learned long ago to mask his frustration behind a calm, unshakable exterior. Still, Naomi wasn't about to let this slide. "That's odd," she said, her voice carrying a sharp edge. "Because I called yesterday to confirm, and your staff assured me our suite was reserved and ready for check-in." Emma stiffened. For the first time, a flicker of unease crossed her expression, but it was gone just as quickly. "Well," she said, forcing a polite smile, "things change. We had an unexpected surge of bookings, and unfortunately, we can't accommodate you tonight." Jonathan exchanged a glance with Naomi. They both knew this was a lie. The Grand Wellington wasn't some cheap roadside motel. It was a high-end luxury hotel with a precise, meticulous booking system. Reservations didn't just disappear overnight. Ava, their 7-year-old daughter, had been standing quietly beside her mother, hugging her stuffed bear. But now, she looked up, her brows knitting together in confusion. "But Mama," she said softly, tugging on Naomi's sleeve. "We have a room, right?" Naomi's heart clenched. She hated that her daughter had to witness this. Before she could respond, the glass doors of the hotel lobby slid open again. A middle-aged white man in a casual golf polo and khakis strolled in, pulling a suitcase behind him. "Hey there," he said, approaching the desk with an easy smile. "I'd like to book a room for the night." Emma's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The tension in her shoulders disappeared, replaced by a bright, welcoming expression. "Of course, sir," she said, her voice suddenly sweet and professional. Her fingers danced across the keyboard with a newfound sense of urgency. Within seconds, she nodded and said, "We have a deluxe suite available. Would you like a city view or a garden view?" Silence. Jonathan and Naomi stood frozen, their expressions carefully neutral. But the weight of the moment pressed against them like an invisible force. Ava, still too young to fully understand what was happening, blinked up at her mother, her innocent voice breaking the heavy silence. "Why do they get a room, Mama?" she asked, her small fingers clutching Naomi's sleeve. "Why can't we stay here too?" Naomi felt something tighten in her chest, a mix of frustration, anger, and sorrow. She knelt down, gently smoothing Ava's hair. "Sometimes, baby," she said softly, "people make unfair decisions." Jonathan exhaled slowly through his nose, before turning back to Emma. His voice, though calm, carried an unmistakable weight. "You just told us you were fully booked," he said, "and yet somehow you have a suite available." Emma stiffened. She opened her mouth, but before she could scramble for an excuse, the hotel manager, Richard, stepped forward. Richard had been standing nearby, arms crossed, watching the entire exchange with thinly veiled disapproval. "Now," he cleared his throat and placed a firm hand on the counter, inserting himself into the conversation. "I'm afraid there's nothing more we can do for you," he said, his tone cool and dismissive. "If you don't have a valid reservation in our system, then I'm sorry, but we can't offer you a room." Jonathan's fingers tightened around his phone. He could feel Naomi tense beside him. He had dealt with people like Richard before, men who hid their prejudice behind polite words and rigid policies. Jonathan wasn't a man who liked causing a scene. He had spent his entire life working twice as hard, proving himself over and over, only to still face moments like this. Moments where his presence was seen as an inconvenience rather than a guest to be welcomed. Naomi placed a hand on his arm, grounding him. Ava, still waiting for an answer, looked between the adults with wide, confused eyes. She asked again, her voice small but piercing in the silence. "Why can't we stay here, Mama?" For the first time, Richard's expression flickered. A moment of discomfort. Maybe because he had children of his own. Maybe because the innocence of a child made the ugliness of discrimination impossible to ignore. Naomi took a slow breath and straightened, lifting her chin. She wasn't going to argue, she wasn't going to beg. Instead, she pulled out her phone. "Very well," she said smoothly. "If there's no room for us here, then I suppose we'll have to speak to the owner about this." Misunderstanding. For the first time, a shadow of worry crossed Richard's face. And Jonathan just smiled, because he already knew something they didn't. For a moment, the air in the grand lobby of the Grand Wellington Hotel felt heavier, thick with something unspoken. The soft classical music playing through the overhead speakers did little to ease the tension. Jonathan Carter stood still, his dark eyes locked onto Richard, the hotel manager, who had just dismissed them with an air of casual condescension. Naomi could feel the restrained power in her husband's stance. Not anger, not frustration, but something deeper, something colder, still calm, still controlled, yet undeniably dangerous. Jonathan's lips pressed into a thin line before he finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding," he said. "I'd like to speak with the owner." A flicker of something, irritation, amusement, maybe even arrogance, passed through Richard's expression. His arms crossed over his chest as he let out a small, patronizing chuckle. "The owner?" Richard repeated, as if the mere suggestion was absurd. His smile was tight, forced. "Sir, the owner of this hotel doesn't waste time meeting with customers like you." He didn't say the words outright, but the implication dripped from his tone like poison. Jonathan didn't flinch, didn't scowl, didn't react the way Richard expected him to. Instead, he smiled, a small, knowing smile, a smile that wasn't born out of humor, but rather from a quiet, dangerous confidence. Emma, the receptionist, shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that something felt off. The way Jonathan stood there, so composed, so utterly unaffected by Richard's attempt to belittle him, it was unsettling. There was something about him, something she couldn't quite place. Naomi, meanwhile, had already pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen, her expression unreadable as she typed something with precision and intent. She didn't need to ask her husband what he was planning. She already knew. and so did Jonathan. Richard, oblivious to the shift in atmosphere, scoffed. "Sir, I don't know who you think you are, but this is a private establishment. If you're not a paying guest, I'll have to ask you to leave." Jonathan tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady, unwavering. "You're absolutely sure you want to do this?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge of warning, yet still calm. Richard rolled his eyes. "I'm sure." Jonathan chuckled softly, under his breath. Not in amusement, but because he knew something they didn't, and that was about to change. The tension in the lobby was palpable, hanging in the air like a storm cloud about to burst. Emma and Richard exchanged glances, both of them visibly irritated by the unwavering confidence of the man standing before them. Jonathan still hadn't raised his voice, hadn't resorted to anger or demands, yet somehow his calm demeanor made them uneasy. Naomi, still holding her phone, glanced at her husband with the ghost of a smirk on her lips. She knew. She knew exactly what was coming, and when the grand doors of the hotel swung open with force, a gust of cold night air rushing into the lobby, it was clear that Richard and Emma were about to find out too. A tall man in an expensive charcoal gray suit strode inside, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. His expression was thunderous, dark eyes scanning the room with an intensity that made the air feel even heavier. The second Richard saw him, his face drained of color. "Mr. Whitmore," he stammered, suddenly standing straighter, his arrogance melting into panic. Emma froze behind the desk, her hands instinctively clasping together, as if trying to make herself smaller. Jonathan simply folded his arms across his chest, watching the scene unfold with quiet amusement. "Would someone care to explain to me?" The man's voice was low but sharp as a blade. "Why I just received a message saying that my own family was denied service in my hotel." A sharp silence. Richard swallowed hard. "Sir, shut up." The words cut through the air like a whip, and Richard snapped his mouth shut immediately. Emma looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Mr. Whitmore exhaled slowly through his nose before turning his sharp gaze to Jonathan, and in that split second his expression transformed completely. His face lit up in surprise and recognition, and without hesitation he crossed the space between them and pulled Jonathan into a firm handshake. No, an embrace. "You should have told me you were coming, man," Whitmore said, his voice now warm, filled with familiarity. "You know I'd have had the presidential suite ready for you." Emma's eyes widened in horror. Richard took a small step back, as if suddenly realizing the gravity of his mistake. Jonathan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Didn't think I had to announce my arrival just to get the room I already paid for." Whitmore's expression darkened again. He slowly turned his attention back to Richard and Emma. "Tell me," he said, voice dangerously quiet, "what exactly happened here?" Neither of them spoke. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it, his lips pressing into a thin, pale line. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she tried to maintain her composure. Whitmore glanced at Naomi, and she simply raised an eyebrow before tilting her phone screen toward him. One glance was enough, a record of everything, the dismissive words, the outright lies. The moment they handed a white customer a room after claiming they were full was right there in text messages and video. Recordings. Whitmore inhaled deeply, his jaw tight with restrained fury. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath before turning back to Richard and Emma. "Both of you," he said, voice cold, "are fired, effective immediately." Emma let out a small, strangled gasp. Richard's face twisted in desperation. "Sir, please. It was a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding." Whitmore's voice rose slightly, his control slipping. "You denied service to my brother-in-law. You insulted my family. You thought you could treat people like garbage just because you assumed they weren't important enough to matter." His eyes flashed with disgust. "You don't deserve to represent this hotel." Emma looked like she wanted to cry. Richard's face had turned a sickly shade of gray. "Security will escort you out," Whitmore finished coldly. "And trust me, you won't be getting a reference from me." Two uniformed security guards appeared at his signal, stepping forward to remove the disgraced employees from the premises. As they were led away, Richard glanced back one last time, his face a mixture of shock, humiliation, and regret. But Jonathan didn't spare him a second glance. Instead, he turned to Naomi, who was now fully smiling, and then knelt down beside Ava, gently tucking a loose curl behind her ear. "See, sweetheart," he murmured. "Sometimes people make unfair decisions, but in the end, truth always wins." Ava's lips curled into a small, sleepy smile, and she hugged her stuffed bear closer. Whitmore clapped Jonathan on the shoulder. "Come on," he said, his expression now much lighter. "Let's get you guys settled into the best suite we have." And, just like that, the real owners of the hotel walked past the front desk, their presence a reminder that justice had been served, and that power, real power, didn't always look the way people expected it to. The lobby of the Grand Wellington was silent, a heavy, suffocating kind of silence that crushed the air from the room. Richard and Emma stood frozen, their once confident expressions now etched with dread. Moments ago, they had been in complete control, believing they could dictate who was worthy of staying at their prestigious hotel. Now they stood on the edge of ruin. Richard, ever the smooth talker, found his voice first. "Mr. Whitmore, please, I can explain," he stammered, his forehead beading with sweat. We thought they were just some ordinary guests, not—" He cut himself off too late. Whitmore's jaw tightened, his eyes dark with fury. "Not what, Richard?" he asked, his voice sharp as glass. Richard's mouth opened and closed, scrambling for an answer, but deep down he knew there was no way out of this. Emma, meanwhile, had gone completely pale. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the edge of the front desk, her breath uneven. "Sir, I wasn't trying to be rude," she whispered. I didn't realize." Whitmore let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "You didn't realize that my family deserved respect? That every guest deserves respect regardless of who they are?" His voice rose slightly, filling the vast, elegant space of the lobby. "You both had multiple chances to do the right thing. You failed, not because you didn't know better, but because you didn't care." Richard tried one last time. "Please, sir, we've been with this hotel for years. This is just a misunderstanding." Jonathan, who had been watching quietly, finally spoke. His voice was calm but unshakable. "Was it a misunderstanding when you refused to look at our reservation?" he asked. Richard flinched. "Was it a misunderstanding when you lied to our faces about the hotel being full?" Emma let out a shaky breath. "Was it a misunderstanding when you handed a room to someone else right in front of us?" Silence. A heavy, undeniable truth settled over them, the kind that could no longer be twisted, no longer be excused. Whitmore exhaled sharply and straightened his suit jacket. "You're both fired, effective immediately," he declared. Emma let out a small gasp as if she hadn't expected the punishment to actually come. Richard's face twisted in panic, his hands balling into desperate fists. "Sir, please," Emma whispered, her voice cracking. This job is all I have." Whitmore's expression didn't soften. "You should have thought of that before you let your prejudice cost you everything." Richard looked as if he wanted to argue, but the presence of two uniformed security guards stepping forward killed whatever hope he had left. It was over. Their power was gone. As the two disgraced employees were led toward the doors, Emma cast one last look at Jonathan and Naomi, not of anger but of realization. She had underestimated them. She had underestimated the cost of her actions, and now it was too late. The energy in the room shifted as the doors shut behind them. The weight of injustice had been lifted, but instead of triumph, Jonathan only felt a quiet kind of exhaustion. Whitmore turned to him. "John, Naomi," he said, voice softer now. "Please, allow me to make this up to you. Take the presidential suite free of charge. Anything you need, it's yours." Naomi exchanged a look with Jonathan, who gently adjusted the strap of his daughter's backpack on his shoulder. "That's kind of you," Jonathan said, his voice steady and unwavering. But we're going to take our business elsewhere." Whitmore blinked in surprise. You're leaving?" Jonathan nodded. "We never needed a free room," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "We never wanted special treatment. We just wanted to be treated with respect, not because of who we are, but because we're human." His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Whitmore sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I understand," he admitted. "And I'm sorry, truly. I should have trained my staff better. I should have ensured something like this never happened in the first place." Naomi gave a small nod, accepting his words but not letting him off the hook so easily. "Make sure it doesn't happen again," she said simply. Whitmore's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I will." Jonathan glanced down at his daughter, who was staring up at him with tired eyes. "Come on, sweetheart," he murmured, lifting her effortlessly into his arms. "Let's find somewhere else to stay." And just like that, they turned toward the doors, walking out of the grand, golden-lit lobby of the hotel without ever looking back. As they stepped into the cool night air, Jonathan let out a slow breath. Another hotel, another place. Somewhere they wouldn't have to fight for dignity. Somewhere better.